Well, welcome to the Royal College of Physicians of Edinburgh. This is the annual open meeting of the Senior Fellows. Senior Fellows sound very distinguished. We're actually those who are old enough to have survived to retirement and into retirement, and we have a series of lectures to keep our brains working. And one of them, this one, is open to the general public, and you're very welcome. It's nice to see such a good attendance. We have a very distinguished speaker, Roger Crofts, who's a geographer, who'll be known to a number of you. His name's up there, and you can see there are a lot of letters after his name. The one it doesn't mention is that he's a Knight of the Icelandic Order of the Falcon. And I think he's the first such knight we've had speak to us. So he's got a first, another first in his distinguished career. Started in Liverpool in the 1960s, failed to go to the Cavern Club. I asked him about this. He didn't go when the Beatles were just starting out. And then had an academic career in a number of universities before joining the Scottish office, and he was instrumental in the foundation of Scottish National Heritage. And that is a very important organization which you'll know about and which he'll be speaking about. He's now retired. In the way that such people are retired, 2 paragraphs full of the things that he actually does, and he's on lots of committees, gives advice to anyone, talks to anyone. He says he talks to anybody who'll listen in Scotland, Iceland, and Europe on environmental strategy. That's his own description of himself. And to us, he's going to talk about his real business, which is looking after Scotland's nature. So if you would come up and speak to us, Professor Crofts, thank you very much and welcome.
Well, distinguished senior fellows, ladies and gentlemen, if you stand on that wonderful little mountain there, and you all know where it is, don't you? It's not quite a Munro, it's called Ben Stack. And if you look westwards, down past Kinlochbervie, across the Minches, you can see the northern part of the Long Isle. And if you look north, you will see the fine mountains of Arkle and Foinaven, after which racehorses were named. And that gives you a wonderful impression. Like many other mountains, they could be Corbetts or Munros or even MacDonalds that give you a view of Scotland's nature. The long nature, starting way back when we started life in the southern hemisphere near the South Pole. But there's also 2 other pictures there, which are quite deliberate, because they should be Scotland's iconic animal and plant. For some curious reason, the unicorn, which is my nieces and my grandchildren think unicorns are wonderful. But I mean, why does Scotland have an animal that's a mythological thing? Why can't we have the golden eagle, which is absolutely tremendous? And I'm rather prejudiced, I think, rather than having the prickly thistle, and dare I say as an Englishman, does that say something about the culture? Yeah? Why don't we have the bluebell of the Matches fame, Campanula rotundifolia subspecies Scotia. Well, today I'm going to tell you a little bit about the good of Scotland's nature, things that I think are appalling. I'm going to test you then to see how you feel, because nature's not just for environmentologists like me, it's actually for everyone. The debatable issues, and then I'm going to reflect a little of what might happen, including thinking a little bit about the implications of that vote in June 2016. You've all heard, I was asking at lunchtime whether the father of modern geology, Dr. James Hutton, was actually a fellow of this society. He was certainly a founder fellow of the Royal Society of Edinburgh, but he was a medic as well. And of course, it was to him that we have to thank for rebutting the Christian view that the earth was only was formed 4000 BC. And you'll see in the picture on the top left there, the historiographer royal for Scotland, Professor T.C. Smout, and myself peering at these rocks at the base of Salisbury Crags, Hutton's section, where Hutton said, wait a minute, that couldn't possibly have happened in 4,000 years. And then if you go down the coast to Sicker Point, it's a bit of a scramble. I should suggest, given the age of the audience, you stay on the top of the cliffs with a pair of binos. Look there, you see where my two pals are sitting. The rocks on the top are nearly horizontal, but the rocks underneath are vertical. And Hutton said, well, hold on a minute, that must have taken some time and something must have happened in between. And we have to thank that guy for setting us off on recognizing and putting Scotland in the forefront of understanding the earth history, not just of Scotland, but the whole earth. And we have other great places as well. I'm sure many of you will have been to Glenroy and Glengoy in the Lagan near Spearn Bridge and seen these funny lines on the mountainside. They're lake shores when the ice was melting. And it's quite interesting, only in the last few years, scientists have reassessed. They still regard them as lake shorelines, but they have changed the chronology and the events that occurred. So there's still new knowledge. As there is about the history, for instance, of the volcanoes. Here's a lovely little volcano called Hallival on the island of Rum. And really, it's the same generation as the ones we see now in the Azores, the Canaries, and Iceland. In other words, when the Atlantic Ocean was opening up, way back 60 million years or so ago, we had a chain of volcanoes, St Kilda, Skye, Rum, Ardnamurchan, and then the lava flows that go with them that we see in so many places on the west. But if we flip forward to after the Ice Age, we tend to think that most of Scotland doesn't really have many native trees. We tend to think of the oak as the English oak, but we have in European terms one of the great oak forests all the way up the west coast, and this is just a snapshot of it. The trouble is it's been eaten away by sheep and deer over many hundreds of years, and it only keeps going in those nooks and crannies below the crevices and cracks. But it is absolutely fantastic. But it's not just the oak trees, it's because it's in the wet side of the country, it's all the mosses and lichens that live there and make it of great European significance. And if we go up onto some of our mountains, most of our rocks are pretty acidic, but we have bands of nice alkaline rock, like this example here, Ben Lawes. Most people go to Ben Lawes to get to the top and put another stone on in the hope that it will become 4,000 feet high. And then those of us that go take a stone off so that it won't become 4,000 feet high. But if you just veer off to the south, you get these fabulous alpine gardens. And I've just illustrated two there, the alpine mouse here on the right, and the alpine forget-me-not, and so many other species. And you can see them on the hill there looking south over Loch Tay. And of course, just down the estuary from Edinburgh, we have the largest colony of the northern gannets in the world. It's just overtaken, from the last bird counts, the St Kilda archipelago. And there's that fabulous bird that is really magical when you see it fishing. If you sit on the sand dunes at Ravenshoek, down near, just north of Dunbar, for instance, you can see them fishing. And in the winter time, we have this mixing of the birds that are with us all the time, like the oyster catchers here, and those that are visitors from the Arctic realms, particularly from Iceland, the godwits, the knots, and the dunlins. And I was down watching these this morning when I was walking my dogs at the mouth of the River Esk at Musselburgh. It's a fabulous sight, and we're so lucky to have those things to hand. Often we think that it's only the tropical world that has endemic species that are very separate and distinctively different, but we have our own endemic species in Scotland. On Orkney we have the vole, and here I was so lucky one afternoon. I was standing by a dry stone dyke and in Village Bay on Hurter in St Kilda, and out popped the St Kilda wren, which is, from genetic test, is distinctively different. We tend to think that wildlife doesn't like industrial land, but if you go down to Leith Docks, it disproves that point conclusively. These are these birds that are really a bit of a nuisance unless you're wearing a woolly hat in the summer, the Arctic tern, because they're likely to pick you on the head. And for those of us that are focally challenged, like myself, it is a problem. But this site here is one that the birds like, and it is now a European site of importance for breeding Arctic terns. And we have also proved that we can turn the clock around the other way. Instead of regarding a wasteland, this area here, just by the mouth of the Esk at Musselburgh, where the coast has been built out beyond the old race course and the golf course, we have the pulverized fly ash that was pumped along there and dumped from the old Kirkensey power station, which you can see in the background there, of course no longer there. And it has now been made into a nature reserve and a dog walking area, and it's a beautiful place. And it's become so significant, it is now protected under UK legislation for the importance of its nature. So that's, fantastic. But of course, if you read the newspapers, life might look a bit different. Look at these newspaper headlines. The column on the left. Wolves, if we introduce them, will be a disaster for farmers because they're the endangered species. Jobs at risk from excessive culling of deer, warn the gamekeepers. Farmers fear invasion of beavers who will flood their land and bring disease. And on the other side, of course, we must protect the feeding grounds for seabirds, particularly just below the cliffs. Yes, we must make sure that the wildcat, which is very difficult to distinguish genetically from the feral cat, we must make sure that that has a future. And we've got now a big project of reinforcing, is the word used, the golden eagles in the south of Scotland. So there's this polarization of attitudes. And things aren't well. We now have a lot of monitoring data. And we find that there are still too many species in decline, as you will see from this graph, this table. Wintering water birds, breeding seabirds, flowering plants, all declining. And other things are stable. And the only thing that in this broad general categories that are rising are the terrestrial breeding birds. This is a global problem, not just a Scottish problem. We have international targets under the Convention of Biological Diversity, which say we must stop the declines, but we're not succeeding at all for a whole range of reasons. One of the reasons, and a rather tragic one, and an illegal one, is the continuing persecution of the raptor species. That's the golden eagles, the merlins, the hen harriers. Their numbers are naturally suppressed from what biologists tell us they should be. And here we have Bob Elliott, the Chief Investigations Officer of the Royal Society for the Protection of Birds, with a poisoned eagle. And the map on the left shows you the number of persecution incidents. And most recently, there's been a very large study putting radio tags on the golden eagles to show where they suddenly disappear. Is it the battery running out? Well, of course, that's what the gamekeepers say. But you occasionally find bodies, and when they're investigated by the experts at East Craigs near the airport here in Edinburgh, they found they've been poisoned. So there's a real problem. And there's a real problem when we look at the landscape, like is illustrated in this photograph. You may think, well, that's quite nice. We like these open moorlands. That's what surveys say, but this is really degraded. Can I use the word in quotes in this room? Knackered. It is really overgrazed by rabbits, sheep, deer, and people have taken the trees off. And it shouldn't really look like that at all. That's not natural. That is an arrested natural succession. And we can prove that by, if you put a fence up, and you see the difference, either side of the fence. Now, inside the fence, which is on the left-hand side, nothing's been done there at all, apart to keep the grazing animals out. In other words, the seeds were all there. So we have the ground layer that you can see growing, and we have the trees as well. So we've got the willows and the birches and the pines all growing up, and the rowans naturally there. So it could look quite different, and it could be much more biologically productive if we didn't have so many of these grazing animals. We have had a significant reduction in sheep numbers with changes in the EU Common Agricultural Policy. As this map shows, the darker browns and reds show very significant reductions, 35% plus reductions in sheep over the period shown there, 1999 to 2007. And that's having some effect, and we can see regeneration of the shrub level and the tree level. But we're having no success with reducing red deer numbers. And I can't remember how many conversations over the years I've had with successive chairs of the Deer Commission, Red Deer Commission. It's had various names, but look at the numbers really rising. And we've got yet another committee set up by the Cabinet Minister for the Environment to look at this and to sort it out. Well, the answer is to get the guys out with the shotguns, and I'd better be very careful here, to reduce the number of breeding females, because that is where the problem lies. There's not a market in that meat. And I think for you medics, this is really wholesome meat. It's very low fat, I'm told. You should be popularizing the use of venison, like my wonderful hostess did on Saturday evening by cooking us the lovely venison steaks. And the other big issue we have is, of course, the growth of trees. You will remember after the end of the First World War, I'm not suggesting you were around at the time, there was a national imperative to grow homegrown timber. And so experiments that had been done in the 19th century by Maxwell of Pollock House up in the Ben Alder estate proved that you could grow these non-native conifer species, particularly those arising from the Pacific Northwest of the USA and Western Canada, the Sitka spruce. And you can see in the graph there, the green line, the growth in conifer species in terms of the area covered. It's very, very significant indeed, with spruce as the major species and very little broadleaves. And if you ask the foresters, and I had a bit of a ding-dong the other day in Galloway with some foresters, they say, oh, well, of course it's not like that anymore. Well, as I pointed out to them, if you just drive outside the village we were at for the meeting, it's still like it was. And here's an example in the Galloway Hills, Loch Dungeon, and there is, you can see the single species. Now, what we now know, we never think ahead and plan with the future in mind. we should be saying, if we plant single species of things, if disease comes, and it's highly likely with climate change, and we've already seen that with other species, then it could decimate, or just totally, more than decimate, these species. And of course, they are very good at scavenging acid rain, and they're already on acid soils with what we call low buffer status, so that water in Loch Dungeon, in this wonderful place just below the Rins of Kells, is really, really acidic. But of course, the worst atrocity of all, perpetrated by the Forestry Commission, bless them, because they're there to plant trees, to produce timber, and don't think of anything else. So they decided that the best place to do it was in the largest wetland system in Britain, and one of the largest carbon stores. And carbon stores are very, very important in terms of climate change. The largest carbon stores in the Northern Hemisphere, what we call the flow country of Caithness and Sutherland. Look at, can you see? You see these systems, beautiful pool systems, they're natural. See if I can get this gizmo to work. No. You can see the pool systems, and then they've just come in with these big ploughs. A lot of the ploughs just disappeared down into the peat and never been seen again. I mean, a piece of environmental vandalism of extraordinary proportions. And other things have been done. There's lots of examples where we've canalised rivers. Here's an example on the River Tummel, downstream from Pitlochry towards Ballinluig. You can see 1750s, a nice irregular channel, which is exactly how you would predict it to be in nature. And then in 1988, it's been canalised. And the photograph shows what has happened in Perth to stop the flooding, particularly of the North Inch. And to be perfectly honest, the more we canalise rivers, the more the water comes off the hill and floods downstream. You've seen it on the water of Leith here in Edinburgh. But if we planted more trees of the right type in the uplands, if we blocked all the drains, if we had less overgrazing, we would capture more water in its natural place, in the hills, and it wouldn't create the flooding. I don't want to send you all away depressed, and I won't, I hope. But there are some intriguing issues that when you wander around Scotland, as I have done ever since I arrived here in the 1970s, there are some debatable issues. What about digging up peat? Why do we dig up peat? Well, some of it, of course, gentlemen, as you will well know, if you like your Isla malts or your Taliskers, is to dry the grain as part of the whiskey distilling process. And there have been huge arguments on Isla and Duick Moss, for instance, many decades ago, to try and get the balance between keeping these carbon stores, which are also places where geese overwinter, and at the same time provide that level of peat that the distilleries want. I think we've succeeded there, which is good. But there are some people who think we shouldn't have any non-native species here. And I like to point out that, well, that means we're going to cut down all the beech trees. Because the northern natural limit of the beech is in the Chiltern Hills. But the agricultural improvers of the 18th century, particularly like in this part of Aberdeenshire, Grant of Monymusk, and all of these great foreseeing landscape planners put these in, and they're magnificent places. And quite often, you will see wonderful bluebell woods underneath them, and the proper bluebells, the one with the bendy tops, which are our native ones. And of course, the sycamore is, we shouldn't have that either because it's not native, but it's actually a little settlement of all sorts of natural life, of bugs and beasties, of mosses and lichens, as one of my friends from the botanics is peering at there. these days we have lots of arguments about wind farms, but when Tom Johnson was Secretary of State way back in the interwar years and the great push for the hydro schemes, there were huge, great arguments about that. If you read, for instance, the arguments about the Galloway power scheme on the Ken Dee, all the way down to the mouth of the Dee at Kirkcudbright, people really didn't like them. And of course now we say, isn't this wonderful when we're going to electricity generation from renewable sources, we have this base load of about 7% comes from the hydro. So I think too often we don't put things in a time perspective because we're thinking of a single issue. And what about skiing? Somebody was saying just a little while ago, well, of course, it's been a wonderful year for skiing. But when I was responsible for the Highlands and Islands Development Board in the ministry, I think we bailed the Cairngorm Chairlift Company out 5 times. I don't think they do that at Val d'Isère, do they? Or Kistobal, or any of these places. Okay, this little development here, this is the Lect, where one of your former distinguished presidents, the late James Petrie, of course, was a director here. And it was very sensitively done by people who lived locally. But is it really viable commercially? It's not environmentally benign, that's for sure. These are the heather moorlands, which are of European significance. And then, of course, we've done some things where we've never thought the consequence. When it was not fashionable to have mink coats, of course, the mink farmers just cut the fences and they got out. And we've had huge programs to try and capture these mink, as you see with the trap on the left there. And there are other things that just sneak into the country in ballast water on ships or stuck on the hulls of ships. The American signal crayfish is a major, major problem that we have. You're not allowed to kill it. We've argued with Marine Scotland, well, why can't we eat the stuff? I mean, it's quite tasty. It's invaded the rivers in southwest Scotland, like the Cree and the Dee Don, the Dee Ken, but it walks, literally walks, and it's now in the upper waters of the Tweed, one of the major river systems in Britain. It's in the headwaters of the Clyde and in the Ayrshire Dune as well. And nobody seems to know what to do about it, and there is a paralysis in government, not an unusual phenomenon, I have to say. And they will not seriously look at, well, can we not do something about it? Just the same with Himalayan balsam and Japanese knotweed, which, of course, are spread along the rivers. Some people are even saying that, oh, the balsam is lovely, it's a pretty flower, and of course it gives seeds which the birds like. But it's so invasive, we don't know how to get rid of it. We can't use herbicides because then that gets in the watercourses, and we're trying under excellent European directives to increase the quality of our water. But we have proved we can get rid of some things, and an excellent example is on Canna, owned by the National Trust for Scotland, where there's been a major rat eradication programme. And you will see from the map there, they're all the traps, and you can see how dense they are around the coast, and then a grid pattern across the island itself, and it was very successful. And the world experts on this come from New Zealand. And they are just instituting, with their new Prime Minister, a major non-native eradication program there. I don't think they've got a cat in hell's chance, actually, but the fact that they can help us do eradication is wonderful. And many of you will be familiar with the rhododendron ponticum, not the sort of pretty stuff that we have in our botanic garden here in Edinburgh or the one in Glasgow that has been properly collected and curated with the Chinese experts. I mean, this stuff, you cut it and you burn it, and you cut it and you burn it. because it is really invasive and just blocks out everything else. You can see the ground where it's been. It's totally dead. Nothing's growing there at all. Well, if you think that wasn't bad enough, I just want to flag up now 3 other specifically controversial issues. You'll all be familiar with these. They're in the media all of the time. The first one is, who owns the land most important? Now, the First Minister said 432 people own half of Scotland's land. Well, I don't think we can refute that. And we'll be able to prove that conclusively fairly soon, because we will have a register as part of one of the recent land reform acts. But does it matter who owns it? I speak now as not somebody who's looking for righting social wrongs of the past, but somebody who is interested in how the land is best looked after. So if I go to the old wood at Dalkeith, and I look at trees that are 800 years old and that have been used carefully, sustainably for many generations, and they're still there, they're still alive. One owner throughout that period. Is that so bad? Is the successive Dukes of Buccleuch, the Montague Stuarts, that bad? I can't believe it. Or we might have a group of well-intentioned people buying a glen down in the Borders, the Borders Forest Trust at Carafan. And look at the transformation that they can do. You can see the 10-year comparison. They didn't plant the trees for the most part. They did plant some, but they're getting away. Or then I contrast, and I'm going to be critical of the National Trust for Scotland, and I have to say I'm a life member, that Marlodge Estate was bought largely with natural heritage, memorial fund and heritage lottery money, but with a piece of hunting, shooting, sporting family money, which meant that its objectives were a bit polarized, should we say. And as the major heritage conservation charity in Scotland, it hadn't ought to compromise its objectives. It should be there for heritage conservation. I have to say, having visited there last month, things are moving on, but there has been that major tension there, which means after 20 years of ownership, not enough has happened as should have happened. If you care to take your rucksack and walk up the Dee and up the Geldie and then to the Feshie, you come to a totally different realm. This is what it looked like in the late 1960s, early 70s, when I first went there. This is what it looks like now. Who owns it? A billionaire Dane. What he's done, with expert help from an Irishman who leads the whole business and a lot of locals, is to do up all the houses so they're 21st century accommodation, employ lots of locals, get the guns out and shoot every deer that comes in sight, so that you improve the look of the land. And he has, of course, now bought lots of other land, including those iconic mountains in the far northwest, Ben Hope and Ben Loyal. And you may recall that more recently he challenged the Scottish Government decision about wind farms just to the south of there. He lost the case. But here is a rich foreign owner who has got the economics, the society, and the environment all in mind in what he's doing. Is there anything wrong with that? Government is powerless to do anything about it anyway. So there is an issue there, despite the fact that the First Minister is wanting to have 1 million acres in community ownership. I have to ask the question, is the capacity in these communities to do it? Will the community that are planning to buy the island of Ulva, just off northwest Mull, is there capacity there? They might have the money for the capital, but will they have the money to operate it year after year? There are lots of issues in original community-owned places like Assynt and the North Assynt estate where they're saying, we're struggling here. We don't know how to do it. So that model is wrong. This model is right. It's not yet been properly tested and thought through. The second controversial issue is what I call the battle for the moorlands. I'm sure you'll be familiar with this driving around Scotland. We still have sheep on the hills, despite the changes in the Common Agricultural Policy subsidy regime. We have deer for sport, particularly the red deer males. And of course, they're important nature areas for European important species. The government wants to expand our forestry from 17 to 25% by the middle of the century, and therefore this is the best place to do it because there's very little other land. And of course, we want these places for wind turbines, for renewable sources of electricity. So there's a real battle there. And I deliberately put this picture on the right there of the different types of management. The good management in the foreground, the improving management on the right, and the despicable management on the left. Are we going the right way here? Every time we asked, in my days as the Chief Executive of Scottish Natural Heritage, that we should have a strategy which worked out the good places for wind farms that didn't get in the way of other reasons why we might want to use the land, and the places where there should be no go, we were told, go away, the market will decide. And what have we had? Crudely, bloody chaos. The companies are frustrated, the communities don't get any traction on it, and the government keeps changing its mind what it wants to do, particularly Cabinet Minister Fergus Ewing. And we have this unresolved issue that, of course, as you will know, as scientifically trained, the wind doesn't blow all the time, and we do not have the backup to give the baseload electricity at the moment. So we've got what internationally is seen as a wonderful objective of reducing the amount of electricity from fossil fuels. Great, but we haven't actually got the solution as to so what I would call to keep the lights on. And if we look at a particular place on, this is a grouse moor in the photograph. Now, if you know anything about grouse shooting, you need heather. Because heather is the place where the small mammals live, which and where the grouse nest. And you can see the grouse butts on there. It's been so overgrazed by sheep, the heather's vanished. And yet, this wonderful bird, the hen harrier, 400 and odd pairs in Scotland, heavily persecuted by the gamekeepers, with the lairds turning their back, even though new legislation places a vicarious responsibility on them. And we have this, all sorts of experiments, millions of pounds have been poured in to try and balance sheep, grouse, and nature on these places. It's commendable that we're looking for these, but we haven't got what I call a natural solution. We've got an imposed solution which is not sustainable in the long term. And if we look at the forestry expansion, here's just a couple of maps from, you'll notice, Kintyre, distinguishing between 1960 on the left and 1986 on the right. And that sort of expansion of forestry is going to get even more so in Galloway now, because that's the next attack area, and we already have 35% of the land in Galloway in trees, and we're saying, no more, thank you. And finally, should we reintroduce species that have been persecuted out of existence? We had the white-tailed or sea eagle from the 1970s onwards. It's now extremely successful. except in the place where it was originally introduced, which was the Isle of Rum. It never ever has bred there, and nobody's quite worked out why. It breeds on canna, and of course it very successfully breeds on mull. And of course it was terrible as far as the farmers were concerned, because of course the eagles were carrying live, well-grown lambs back to their nests and eating them. And as my expert said, well, they couldn't possibly lift that amount. And now I think it's fair to say that mull has become a tourist attraction because of the sea eagles, and the locals really like them and have headings in the Mullet, the local newspaper, saying, just look after our eagles, what a transformation. And in various parts of Scotland, in Galloway, for instance, very successful reintroduction of the red kite, and in Wales and in the Chilterns, but a very unsuccessful reintroduction in the Black Isle and Easter Ross, where it's still heavily persecuted. This bird is a carrion eater. It doesn't kill live animals, but trying to get that over to farmers and the like. But it brings in lots of people to these areas to see these birds. My wife and I look out of the window in St John's Town of Dalryan. It gives us a little kick in the morning to see them flying around. How fantastic. And the most successful reintroduction, I think, of all, because when the ospreys fly back from their winter haunts in West Africa, it's on the national news now. I mean the UK national news, and that has been spread so beautifully. And it's spread naturally from the original Lochgarten reintroduction site on Speyside. It's now here, for instance, down at Threave. You'll see Threave Castle in the photograph there on the National Trust and Historic Environment Scotland land. And the most recent, of course, the European beaver. The beaver was due to bring in all sorts of waterborne diseases. So I was told by some of my board members who had read some newspaper headline in the Canterbury Bells Times or something like that, or had been sat upon by local fishermen, because I had both of those experiences. They've been reintroduced in Knapdale, which was not the ideal place. What was done here was the most intensive scientific studies first about whether this was biologically a proper thing to do, and there are international protocols to do this. If you answer that question, you then have to answer the societal question. You know, do we want it or not? So now the debates about should we have wolves? Crazy idea, to be honest. Our country's not big enough. Should we have lynx? I think so. But not should we bring them in, as people are suggesting, into the Kielder Forest just over the border in Northumberland, but to actually do the proper assessments using the international protocols by the scientists. That's the way to do it. You go to Loch Gilphead, and the locals think the beavers there are wonderful, because even though often they don't see them, they brought new interest to the area, and that's tremendous, because that's connecting visitors with a natural environment and a natural animal in that environment. So, ladies and gentlemen, let's reflect as I draw this to a close. What gets in the way of conserving nature? Well, I think it's pretty clear from what I've said. It's these invasive species that we see in the rivers, along the rivers and in the river sides. It's the non-native species. It's what I call overexploitation, too many grazing animals, for instance. It's working against nature itself. You know, we think we're the great engineers, but what was written in textbooks that I read as an undergraduate in the 60s, that we know about how nature works, we continue to ignore it. And we confuse the public. And then we've got these two new challenges on the block, both significant in different ways: climate change and Brexit. And climate change, we've done a lot in Scotland which we should be proud of through the legislation, through trying to lower the level of greenhouse gas emissions. but we haven't got the plan on the ground, to be perfectly honest. And I've just used this headline. It's over 10 years old now, that we need to plan our whole landscape so that as it gets warmer, and it is getting warmer, despite what Nigel Lawson and other ignorant people say, we need to help the animal world move further north. And we can plan that. Other countries in Europe have done it. The Dutch are masters. The Estonians have done good work on it as well, for example. And then there's the thing we hate talking about at dinner parties. There's two aspects of Brexit that are really relevant to my topic today. One is the common agriculture policy, and you can see I put the flag up and say, jolly good, we'll get rid of it. And the reason is it is an environmental disaster and it's a public expenditure scandal. The map shows the point. You've read it all in the newspapers about the barley barons and of the east of Scotland. The brightest colours, the red colours, are the amount of payment per parish. You can't go below that to the farm level. Where are the richest farmers in Scotland? Down the east coast. Where are the farms that get most money from the common agriculture policy, i.e. from us and European taxpayers? Down the east coast. Where is the poorest land in Scotland where farmers need help? In the highlands and the islands and the other uplands, and they get less. And the environmental damage and the misuse of public funds is ridiculous. And there are lots of ideas. If you're an insomniac, you go onto my website and you'll see papers about stewardship and a new way of looking at life. The other side of Brexit that I just want to flag up, and there's lots of other angles in terms of looking after the environment, is that we now have this system of European nature areas, special protection areas under the Birds Directive and special areas of conservation under the Habitats and Species Directive. We mustn't lose this. We would have never done it if we weren't part of Europe. It is a unique system regionally in the world. No other part of the world has this system, which is pretty scientifically based, and we must make sure we don't lose that. Well, where do we go from here? I'm a geographer, and I feel that we should be not looking for all Scotland solutions, because if you've been to Shetland, it's quite different from Orkney and Caithness. And it's different in turn from the Borders, which is different in turn from Dumfries and Galloway, and so on. And many years ago in Scottish Natural Heritage, we created that map on the left. We divided Scotland up from all the nature data that we had into 21 regions. And we now have the opportunity through a particular part of the Climate Change Scotland Act 2009 to have strategies for different parts of the country. And what we need to do in that is to recognise this natural diversity and these other 6 things. What I want to flag up is number 3, because we are building on the best agricultural land without any safeguard. It is a public scandal. And I blame Mr. Ross Finney, because he did a consultation in 2003, and everybody but everybody said we must safeguard this, and he just ignored it. And there's no safeguarding. Once you seal the land, you've had it. It's not going to come back. And then there's the number 4 there, is the other one I'm going to flag up, is stop the creeping plethora and lack of planning of wind farms, fish farms, and commercial forestry. We've got to do something about that. If you come to the Royal Society of Edinburgh on the 27th of February, commercial plug, I'll be giving another talk which is going on from this, explaining what I mean. So, does conserving Scotland's nature have a future? Well, there's too many people, so to speak, stand their ground in their prepared positions. They think short term. They think that nature gets in the way of development and development must win, and it's all about money and commercialism. That is a real photo, ladies and gentlemen. It's not a digital fix. It's taken on the Don just downstream from Arford many years ago. But what do we mean by looking after or conserving nature? It's not actually fossilizing and freezing things, covering them in aspect, arresting what nature would do, or stopping people's access and enjoyment to it. It's much more creative and positive things. It's about preserving and protecting the best, creating where we have an opportunity, or restoring where we think it's necessary, adapting and maintaining what I call natural common sense. And it really is important, because I think as a society we have a moral duty. It's an ethical issue, whether the business community like it or not, that we should be protecting what we inherited for our children and our children's children, as we say in the business, in perpetuity, something we forget about. And of course we should honour our legal obligations. So yes, we have a future, despite some of the negatives I've said. One of the great things about the devolution of power and the establishment of the Scottish Parliament is that we have legislation which is really, we wouldn't have had it otherwise, and it has changed the character of things. And we have, as I say there, the knowledge, the expertise, the education, engagement of people like yourselves, and lots of enthusiasm. Thank you very much.
Can you? Yeah, okay. Thank you very much indeed, Roger. Inspiring talk, and I wish you could have gone on a bit longer, but we can come and hear your next talk at the Royal Society. Next week, is it?
In a month's time, yeah.
In a month's time.
Fully booked, actually, but there you go.
Fully booked.
We'll put it on the website. Yes.
Excellent. Now, what about questions? Hands up, anyone who wants to ask a question. Don't be shy. Okay, Liz, you're the first. You get a microphone.
Oh, right. It's probably a very obvious question, but you said no wolves, but lynx okay. And I was wondering why.
Well, it's the evidence from other parts of Europe and also from sort of northwestern USA that these packs grow to significant sizes and they move vast distances, and they are very aggressive and intrusive in communities. We want the wolves to go and hit the deer and the moribund sheep. They're not going to do that necessarily. I'd be perfectly happy for, the biological scientists to do an assessment. But from my knowledge of talking to expert colleagues around Europe, I don't think it's on. The lynx, there would be the best predator, I'm told, on the red deer. And we have the red deer problem. And I have no faith that my good friend Simon Pepper, who is going to chair this committee set up by Rosanna Cunning, will be able to solve it. And I think that has to be part of the equation. It does work elsewhere. And of course, they don't hunt in packs either, so there isn't that societal concern. Okay?
Thank you very much for a fascinating talk. That's a fascinating talk. No.
You got it.
Holding it on doesn't work. I was very interested in your map of farming and the subsidies, because of course the eastern coast is one of the most productive farmlands, and so following that theme, is it possible to have an agricultural system in Scotland which produces food economically and at the same time helps to preserve the environment, which itself, of course, is important to farmers from the whole point of view of fertilization and so on and so forth? And if so, how would you suggest that farming is made sustainable? Would there be a completely different subsidy system, or would you abandon subsidies altogether as it is in New Zealand?
I wouldn't abandon subsidies at all. I think that would be entirely wrong. And people who keep comparing us with New Zealand is nonsense anyway. New Zealand has got a captive market. It happens to be called China. Yeah? My wife's sister is a dairy and beef farmer in New Zealand, and they can just sell the milk through a monopoly intermediary into the Chinese market. We don't have that opportunity at all. Yeah? We're selling lamb to France, for instance. What I think we need, and a lot of us in Scotland have been saying that, and now the good Mr. Gove has actually been saying the same thing, he must have been listening to us, is that we want to get farmers to do what they claim to do, to be the stewards of the land. And they're not always, because they rip out the hedges and therefore undermine the microclimate. They go right to the edge of the streams, and you get therefore nutrient flushes. We want them to be told formally, you don't get any support whatsoever unless you abide by these codes. These codes exist. They've been written down, and they're really excellent. They're not overly bureaucratic. And if you do those standards, and if you seek to improve, then you should get public money, because that's part of a public service to society now and in the future. And at the same time, of course, if you do that, you can then brand the products, whether it's barley for whiskey, or whether it's beef for the butcher, or whether it's lamb for the French market, by saying this is of the highest quality. Now, I say that because what we don't want to do is to banish all subsidies and, go down to the lowest common denominator with the Australians and the New Zealanders and the Argentinians, and to a certain extent the American farmers. We want to keep that quality mark up, because it is there, but we can improve the system and we can make it less bureaucratic.
Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Crofts. That was a fascinating talk. I've never really fully appreciated the cost-benefit of wind farms when you take into account their installation and the damage that does, and their destruction after 20 years, 15 to 25 years, 25 years being generous. I'd be fascinated if anyone has done that cost-benefit analysis.
Well, they have. There's a guy called Pete Smith, who is a Royal Society professor at Aberdeen University, has done a calculator. And the calculator is based on exactly what you're talking about, is the full lifetime costs and benefits. And he reckons on most of these wind farms, you don't get into the plus for carbon until about 25, 27 years, by which time the technology has moved on and the kit is... and that's what we're not thinking. We don't think in the round in these things at all. It's what I use the term natural common sense. Most of these wind farms are on acid soils. So what do? We make big roadways, so the carbon flux from making the roadways is bad. And so you go on. Plus all of the, the greenhouse gases given off in construction of the turbines. So yes, there is a methodology. The companies don't need to bother about it, because of course the subsidies are still built into the system in one way or another, and the government plays games so that us poor customers, who ultimately pay the price through our electricity bills, don't really spot it.
I had the impression that we weren't happy with the result of the Brexit referendum. Can you tell us how that is likely to impact on Scottish natural heritage?
Well, we just set up a group in the Royal Society of Edinburgh. We had our first meeting last week, and we were just listing the number of directives on the environment. And it made us all realise, and there were colleagues who used to work for the Scottish Environmental Protection Agency, how much positive benefit we've had, which was pretty unlikely under a UK government regime. And I'm thinking particularly of air quality, water quality, waste reduction, and all of these things, in addition to the nature benefits that I mentioned earlier. And irrespective of where I sit on that issue, and I'm probably in the same as most people in this room because I've never met anybody on the other side, what we have to do is to make sure that we retain all the gains through the so-called Great Repeal Bill. It's not a repeal bill at all. I mean, I've done legislation and we're not repealing anything. We're actually trying to translate into UK statute and hopefully then into Scottish statute all of these benefits. And if we don't, irrespective of whether we leave or not, we have a soft or a hard, we want to have these environmental protection systems which have been of great benefit, not just to nature, but to society and the well-being of people. And here's a medical audience. You will recognize the importance of having, the clean air, the clean water, particularly in, the poor health hotspots in the west of Scotland.
One last question from one of our visitors at the back.
I was interested to hear about when you touched on the question of encroachment of agricultural land by building. Is there any official assessment of how much agricultural land we have, how much we need for the future, and how much food should be imported in Scotland and the UK?
I'm not aware of any studies that have been published. I do know, though, that John Hutton Institute is working on this now. My particular worry is what I see, just outside my back door, so to speak, in East Lothian, where we have class A1, A2, the highest quality agriculture land being built on. And when you talk to the planners, they don't even recognise that that's a consideration, because it has to be housing. And yes, it's a fair point that you make, because what we should be looking at, and it can be done now. The John Hutton Institute has the ability to do forward modelling on what the capability of the land could be in 2050. I've seen some of their maps recently. And therefore what land that is marginal from an agricultural point of view, what that could produce with a generally warmer climate with a longer growing season. But and I hope that this data will be developed further and published. But it's a very important question you ask.
Thank you very much indeed for a very interesting and inspiring talk. And the questions you've been asked illustrate the point that you have kept people's attention to the end. Wanting more. This is characteristic of older audiences. Young people find it difficult to attend. The overriding thing in my head after this talk is how difficult it must be to be a First Minister, trying to juggle all these conflicting interests on environment and on industry and on the economy. And agriculture and so on. And it really makes you wonder why people go into politics. But one thing you can be sure of is that if they don't go to experts, scientific experts, they'll continue to make a terrible mess of things. And that's what we need to press on politicians. They need experts. They need people from the universities who know the subject, who've done the research, or can do the research. And I hope, though you're not part of the government system anymore, I do hope you're continuing to give them good advice when you can. Thank you very much indeed. You did mention malt whiskey, and this is something to drink it out of as a thank you.
Oh, thank you very much indeed.
Thanks very much, Roger.
I thought it would be a history of the college.